Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I love games, whether it be board games, whether it be miniature games or video games. I'm into that sort of stuff, just like you. And I also like the samurai, hence of course buying Sekiro Shadows Die Twice was a must. Sekiro, a game that will punish you each chance it gets, a game that will make sure that you swallow up that overweening gamer pride of yours, a game that will unravel your confidence each time you botch the job. It's like Dark Souls and Tenchu had sex while ingesting arsenic. But we are not here to talk about the gameplay, are we? Well, this is the second episode of a mini-series about Sekiro on this channel, where I historically evaluate the setting of this game. Now, given that there are ghosts, ogres, suspension of disbelief, I'm all for that. Still, since the developers of the game actually did put effort into making the historical background of this game believable, today we will look at the armor and weapons to see how accurate they are. Now, if you're interested in the Japanese feudal samurai castles that you see in this game and want to know if they are historically accurate or not, and you want to learn a thing or two about the real deals with actual imagery from Japan, I recommend you to check out my previous video of this series. You'll find a link in the description below, and the response video to my own original video made by Antony Cummins. You'll find again links in the description below. Now, first and foremost, I'd like to address the topic of the armor. Now, in this game, Sekiro, I can see that the developers have done quite a lot of research, and definitely they have copied some originals because the armor looks really good. However, I do have something to say about the choice of gear and the way they have decided to equip and supplement and supply their troops. And first and foremost, in this game we face a whole range of enemies. We fight Ashigaru, we fight samurai, we fight generals, we fight all sorts of enemies, even a knight in full plate armor. More on that later. Now, one thing that I'd like to start talking about is the kasa. Now, what is this? Well, this is a very, very bad replica, very, very cheap, but basically it's the sort of hat that people wore and sometimes still wear in Asia. Now, in Japan, these were called kasa. Interestingly enough, in Japanese, the word kasa, even in modern Japanese, means umbrella, although you write it with a different kanji. The kanji that you use to write the word for the hat is an interesting word because it's this kanji here, and it's the combination of two radicals. The first one meaning to stand up, the verb tatsu in Japanese, and the second one means take, which translates into bamboo. So it's standing up with a bamboo, which means a hat, that you're wearing a hat most likely made of bamboo, and that it was used to protect the peasants from the rain, hence the fact that it has the same sound as the Japanese umbrella. But what we see in-game is a different version, and it's called a jingasa. Now, gasa, although you hear the G sound now rather than the K sound, that is a common phenomenon in Japanese. It's a pronunciation rule, and basically it's the vocalized version of the K sound, and this happens all the time in Japanese when you put two kanji together. Oftentimes the second one is vocalized in pronunciation. So it's the same word, it's the same kanji, it just means hat. However, the jin, the kanji that we add in front of it, before it, it means a battle or camp. So basically it's a battle hat or a camp hat. Camp meaning a battlefield, for example. So it's the sort of armored hat that we see most of the times Ashigaru wear, so the light infantry or light feet, literally. Although these sometimes were also used by samurai, although when you reach perhaps Edo period, then of course there is more of a standardization of what an Ashigaru is, because an Ashigaru begins as a sort of peasantry militia that is quickly armed, most of the times not even trained, and just put there to support the professional troops, namely the samurai. But as we reach the Sengoku period, as we go towards the end of the Sengoku period, and therefore we start going into the Edo period, then the Ashigaru becomes a semi-professional sort of troop, and some of these guys are actually become quite skilled at fighting. Now, in the game, in fact, and that's kind of interesting, the Ashigaru, or samurai, we don't really know, I think they are Ashigaru, who wear these are actually stronger to defeat and stronger to fight than the guys who don't. Does that make sense? Well, the fact that we see a better geared up Ashigaru, and one who doesn't really have much gear, gives us already a hint into his wealth. So definitely the guy who's wearing the armored hat and the rest of the gear is most likely more wealthy than the other one, which also could translate into a more successful one. So yes, it does make sense. Perhaps as someone who's been doing it for longer, and therefore he could afford better gear. Interestingly enough, though you do write it with the kanji of bamboo, the armored version, the Jingasa, was actually made of iron. Okay, so what I brought here now to show you is a kote. This is an armored sleeve. It's part of the samurai gear, and it's made of iron and steel and interlocking links. Okay, with together it's all laced up and riveted on top of a Japanese silk sleeve. Now, of course, we see this sort of protection for the arm worn by the samurai and worn by the Ashigaru. That's obvious because this was used by everyone. However, we also see that our protagonist, the shinobi, is wearing one of these. Would it make sense? My opinion, yes. He only wears one, mind you, but I think that makes sense. The other arm is prosthetic anyways, so of course it doesn't really, probably he can block things anyways with that arm. I believe it's made of metal. I'm not sure what it's made of, but definitely he's not wearing a full sleeve on the prosthetic arm, only a little bit, and he's wearing a full sleeve on the other arm. And I think it makes sense because it grants you a lot of protection, given not as much as a European knightly harness full plate arm, of course, but it still does give you some protection. I mean, these plates, they are resistant. So unless you hit it with something really strong, like, I don't know, some sort of mace, I think you should be okay. It's going to protect you from cutting, and it's going to protect you from piercing to a certain extent. Not as much, but to a certain extent. But the reason why I think it makes sense that even a shinobi uses it in the game is because it's incredibly light. So again, with armor, it's always a compromise between mobility and protection. Now, with a shinobi doing some stealth action while wearing full plate late medieval European armor, probably not. But this sort of protection, I think is good that he's wearing it, because it does protect, so he can use it to deflect blows. At least it could, maybe not in game, but he could use it to deflect blows, and it doesn't really impede him in any way. It doesn't block him. He can still roll, he can still jump. This is incredibly light, like you wouldn't believe. And I wear it, I use it, so I know what I'm talking about. You can wear it all day, and if you could even forget the fact that you're wearing it. It's incredibly light, so I think that was a good choice. Not to mention that it's also very stylish. Okay, now talking specifically about the samurai armor and the Ashigaru armor that we see in game. As I said, the shape is good, the placing is good, but there are a few things that I think are worth mentioning. What kind of armor are we seeing? Okay, so the game is set in the Sengoku Jidai, and that means that we should see a specific kind of armor. However, one thing that is also important to note is that in Japan there was a humongous sort of variation. You had such a wide range of types of armor, of ways of lacing them, of ways of decorating them, that it's really no surprise that we should be seeing lots of different kinds of both the cuirass, but also helmets and whatnot. Now, what's interesting to say is that there are two kinds of armor that I'm very happy that we see in this game, and they are the Okegawa-do Gusoku in the Nimaido style, the Tosei Gusoku, and this is the modern sort of armor. This is the kind of armor arguably was influenced by the contact with the West. Now, not everyone agrees with this. That is my opinion as well. Some people say that most likely the Japanese would have eventually evolved their sort of armor into full plate, which is basically what you see here. This is exactly the sort of armor that I'm talking about. It's solid, shell-like armor. Some people even call it similar to the skin of a snake, the belly of a snake. It's another possible name for it. And this kind of armor is plate. It's very resistant. It's solid, and it's excellent against arquebus fire, which is exactly the sort of weapons that we would have to face, among others, in the late Sengoku period. So some people say this sort of solid shell-like armor came about because of the influence of the West, and that's exactly what I think. Up to the point in which the Portuguese and the Japanese meet, everything was laced up. So even if you have scale or sometimes itamonos or plate, everything was laced up in several ways, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But immediately after the Japanese meet the Europeans, then they start riveting up the plates, which is exactly what you do with this sort of more solid kind of construction, which is also more tapered and it sort of follows the silhouette of the wearer, making it also lighter to wear. Regardless of the fact that there might not actually be a weight difference, everything is much more distributed on the body, and so it's a more functional armor. Case, is it really random the fact that this happened immediately after the encounter with the Europeans, and we know the European smithing already riveted everything together? I say no. Although it's curious to say that the Japanese did use rivets in the Iron Age, but for some reasons they just stopped doing it. We don't really know why. Anyways, whether or not this came about because of the influence of the Portuguese, it is a fact that it was a very, very popular sort of armor in Japan in the late Sengoku period, because it granted better protection, and the 2 to 3 millimeters thick plates were already enough to stop arquebus balls at a distance of 15 meters. So in the game we do see this sort of armor together with another kind of laced up armor, which is called Mogane Dogusoku. Oh, and by the way, it's Mogami, sorry, not Mogane, got confused, Mogami. Is this modern armor? Some people do classify it as Tosei Gusoku. I personally prefer to classify it as pre-modern, because it's the sort of armor that was used up to when this was invented. Is it anachronistic? I'm gonna say no, because the Mogane Dogusoku was so popular before the arrival of this sort of invention that they would have been everywhere, okay? And you can recognize them because they still have lacing in the front plate of the pectoral plates. However, you see a lot less lacing. You basically have lacing, vertical lacing, space, vertical lacing, space, vertical lacing, space, and that is because during the Sengoku period, armor production reached such a peak and such a zenith that it was so much important to produce armor quickly, to arm up loads of soldiers and samurai, that they had to come up with an easier way to lace up things, and this is exactly what Mogane Dogusoku is. It's a less complicated and less decorative way of lacing up the plates of a breastplate of a samurai or an ashigaru, of course, and that is why I think it really, really makes sense that it is in the Sengoku period. But I think it would have been nice to see generals wearing this sort of armor, although again we could excuse them because some high-ranking samurai, although they switched to this sort of armor, so the Tosei Gusoku, the Okegawa Do, they still had simulated scales and sometimes simulated lacing to make it look like the previous version. So again, we could excuse it that way. So again, I'm not really complaining about it. I'm just saying it would have been nicer to also see a bit more of this. Okay, so we understand that the game is set in the Sengoku period, but the Sengoku period is a big period. So we're talking about the late 15th century all the way to 1603. So it's a big period. Now, things will change a lot. And as far as I understand, although I don't know the exact official date, it is obvious that the game is set in the late Sengoku period, because it has to be after 1543. Why? Because we see in-game Tanegashima, Teppo. Now this is the matchlock type arquebus, and these were mass produced in Japan towards the end of towards the late 16th century, and these were copied by some Portuguese original models. And this is in fact a very interesting story, because this is the very first encounter between the Portuguese and the Japanese. And this was a fortuitous situation, because basically you had some Portuguese merchants and in general some Portuguese people who were on top of a Chinese junk. And before you say anything about this, junk can also mean a type of Chinese ship. I didn't invent the English language, not my problem. So these Portuguese were on a Chinese junk, and there was a shipwreck, and they ended up in the island of Tanegashima. Now, among the things that this ship was bringing, some of the stuff that the ship was carrying, some of the goods, they also had some examples of these. Now, this is a very, very advanced and refined kind of weapon for the time. Now the Japanese, it's not the first time that the Japanese encountered gunpowder. Some people say it is, but it wasn't. Gunpowder was already present, for example, in Mongolia. In fact, the Mongols used some form of early explosive against the samurai during their invasions of Japan. We know that possibly they saw some other forms of previous models of these guys from Turkey. So again, not the first kind of fire weapon or gun that the Japanese saw, but definitely the first one that really impressed them. And that is because the sort of matchlock type arquebus that the Portuguese used was a very much of an improved version. It was easier to use, it was easier to aim, it had a much better and safer triggering mechanism, and the Japanese very much liked it. In fact, sometimes I read people in forums saying, the samurai, they were so honorable, they would never use gunpowder. Yeah, go tell that to Oda Nobunaga, who frigging must produce these. Some writers of the time mentioned the number 300,000 units for the amount of arquebuses that were produced. Possibly this is an exaggerated figure, but still these were mass produced in such a level that at the end of the Sengoku period there were more arquebus type matchlocks, arquebuses in Japan than there were in the entirety of Europe. So the Japanese definitely used these because they gave them a massive edge in battle and during sieges. Now, going back to this is again, in Japanese it's called Tanegashima Teppo, where Teppo basically means arquebus or a gun, and Tanegashima is the island where these Portuguese arrived. But the reason why it's called Tanegashima is because they were mass-produced there. And it's interesting because Tanegashima is a small island. I've been there. It's a very, very small island just in the south of Japan, just south of Kagoshima and in Kyushu. And it's interesting because Tanegashima was a very famous sword-producing place. And this is interesting, and that's why I said it was a fortuitous encounter, because it was perfect to change some sword-making smiths who already knew how to work with steel and iron into Tanegashima, into gun-making smiths. So basically they already had the industry there ready. And the encounter with the Westerners, with the Portuguese, allowed them to copy these and mass-produce them. So 1543 is when this happens. Then, of course, you need to give them a few years to mass produce them. In the game, we see that these are used by a lot of Ashigaru, a lot of troops of the clan that we face, and therefore, this is definitely a late Sengoku Jidai setting. So the arquebuses in-game, which, by the way, can also be called in Japanese Hinawaju, which literally means fuse guns. It's another way to call them. So Tanegashima Teppo or Hinawaju, they are very well reproduced. I'm very happy about it. Maybe they're a little too quick at reloading, but again, that's for gameplay purposes. I understand that. But very well made, very well executed, excellently placed in the setting. So very well done. But definitely, we are in the late Sengoku Jidai. Now, if there is one man that I really, really like about this game is Robert, my mate. I mean, they put a late 16th century European knight into the game as a boss, which already is a really cool thing, and he's freaking invulnerable because of the full plate armor he's wearing. Like, you can cut him literally all day because you're using a sword. It's doing nothing to him. Now that alone worth all the money I spent on the game. Like, really made me happy, because that is exactly how things would be. You see how realistic mechanics can work when they're very well implemented into a game. They basically made a character boss who cannot be killed unless you find the way to do it, which is really realistic. And maybe I shouldn't say it. Okay, let's say this. Spoiler alert, I'm about to tell you how to kill this guy, so if you don't know or you don't want to know, just skip ahead 30 seconds and you'll be alright. Okay, so for those of you who stayed here, Robert, you're just gonna push him over the edge, and he needs to fall and die. So basically, that's the way you kill him, and and that's really cool because the armor he has makes him invulnerable, and I love it because of the weapons you're using. It's realistic. You cannot cut through European plate armor, and it will be really difficult to also cut through Japanese armor. As a matter of fact, it's really difficult to cut through armor, let's put it this way, but particularly late European armor. Now, apart from this, let's talk about the armor he's using and the weapon he's wielding. Now, the sword that he's wielding, it's a massive sword. I think it would qualify as a great sword, although it looks like a a longsword, but I think it's too big to be a longsword. Not sure. Maybe I'll ask my friend Matt Easton or Shad. They're very much into the slight difference sometimes between longsword, a massive longsword, and a smaller greatsword. I believe my money is on a greatsword. It's really, really massive. It looks good. It looks European. Maybe the only thing that I would complain about is the finish on the blade, because European swords had some incredible, exquisite finish on their blades, like really, really polished. And this is in fact a problem that they have also in the game KCD, so Kingdom Come Deliverance. Also there, the finish on most blades looks really bad compared to the real finish on the sort of blades the European, particularly wealthy knights, would own. That is a problem with reenactorism. It's a reenactorism basically, because some reenactors have blades with that sort of finish and polish, and I think that's where they get it. So the sword should be better in quality, but apart from that, it's okay. The armor looks a lot like this. Now this is a real example, and this is a replica made by craftsmen of Taurica, basically my personal armorers, because they are making my own full plate suit of armor, which is a crowdfunding. And if you want to know more about the project, and if you want to chip in, if you want to help out, you will find a link in the description below. But suffice to say that, as you can see, this is a typical sort of 16th century extended protection and extended fold, which we also find incidentally in another game called The Bastard's Tale, which is a little indie game, very, very difficult. And if you haven't played it and you like retro gaming or games that look like retro, then you can check it out. You can find it on PS Network, PS Store. And it's another game where we see a knight wearing that sort of armor. So late 16th century, really good. And the armor overall looks all right. It looks good. And I think it's another good thing, another thumbs up for this guy, Robert. Big thumbs up. Excellent idea. Alright, number one, so I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Also, stay tuned and keep in mind that I'm going to make another episode of this mini-series dedicated to the game Sekiro. And next time, we're going to explore and study the real history of the Ashina clan. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.